Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today's session, Elevate Your Value, How to Get a Seat at the Table. I'm Greg Slate, and I'm a client partner here at Galvonize, and I'll be moderating today's session. The work you do matters, but if you do not share it with the C-suite, how do you expect your team's needs to be prioritized? In today's session, we will discuss best practices on how to communicate what matters when it matters, telling your story in the language of business, and identifying available technologies and tools to assist in structuring your message. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. I would like to introduce to you Geoff Hudson-Searle. Geoff is a director at IBEM.
Greg, thank you very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted that Galvanize has invited me to speak about pretty much some of the most important issues that are being talked about in business today. And I certainly look forward to sharing both my experiences and also some of the trends, as I said, that are leading some of this discussion. So who am I? I am Geoff Hudson-Searle. I'm a veteran executive serial business advisor on growth phase companies. I've both got C-suite executive, both on private and publicly listed companies experience, both CCO, global CMO, CEO, and I represent myself as the CEO of IBEM. I've been a non-executive director, which gives me the credentials to be here today for about the last 13 years. And those companies that I've represented come across in regulation, technology, internet security. And in addition to that, I'm now writing my sixth book called The Trust Paradigm, which should be out in publication next year. Before I start, I'd like to say that from an exclaimer point of view, that all the opinions expressed today, during this discussion, are the explicit expressions of Geoff Hudson-Searle and not of any of the companies that I represent. Okay, so no question, we are living in incredibly interesting times. I mean, from a positive point of view, I'm glad that I'm a part of this new look era, which has, without question, has accelerated everything we've done from a behavior point of view. I think, as someone said to me the other day, COVID-19 has changed the experience of being an employee, a customer, a citizen, and actually a human being forever. Well, let's look at some of the last 12 months, shall we? I mean, if we could look at COVID-19 and look at how that has been responsible for the displacement in C-suite management and in some respect the board, was it COVID-19, or was it something that we already knew, that there were operational gaps and flaws across businesses as a direct reflection of our skills and the skills that were being deployed as a composition? Well, that's an interesting question, and maybe that's one that we'll come back to discuss later. I think leadership needs to step up in many ways, and I think that leaders need to understand what they do, how they've acted during this time of crisis, but more importantly, post-normal, how this will now shape the way employers will start to, let's say, how the office will run, how the office will regime. We've talked, there's a lot of discussion on and around digital trust and recently zero trust, and how that works together with things like corporate governance or ethics leadership, as it may be. We at IBEM commissioned a trust report around the May period of last year. No big surprise that the findings of this report, which were collected by DataPad for us, showed that 69% of all employees had a trust problem with either the CEO or line manager. So leaders now need to work harder. They need to gain their trust. You could question actually that they've threatened their staff with respect during this time if they haven't stepped up to meet the demands of their employees. I think it's important to recognise that, an EY is something that we looked at last year with respect to um, the BCP, business continuity planning, and also the business response planning, and looking at exactly how many companies felt that their board members could step up. And it was very interesting to see that for a major risk event like COVID-19, there was only something like 80% of board members felt that they couldn't step up, and only 20% globally and internationally had put a business response plan into play and were comfortable in executing that. So I want to talk a little bit here today around, some of the challenges, and we've talked about leadership and stepping up, and how that's never really been a big surprise. There is a greater need for corporate governance. There is a greater need for risk governance, and there is a greater need for ESG, environmental, social, and governance coming from board. McKinsey's report in the same time, which they do annually around global leadership, said the same. 14,500 people globally and internationally, okay, that they surveyed. 84% said they didn't have the tools to manage the changes of the future. That's a worry. That's a big worry for management, leadership, and boards when you've got that kind of survey report that's coming back. But more importantly, what do we now need to do to improve? COVID's no question about the fact how it's accelerated speed. It's accelerated speed by probably 7 years in a period of 7 months, no less. And people keep talking about, the revolution and the fourth industrial revolution, and how speed, is unprecedented, and how we can not only handle this period, but more importantly, what are we looking to do to address that period? I don't know. Trust is a big issue. It's nothing new either. I mean, it's been around for decades. Systematic failures. When we start looking about trust, and we start thinking about how we are as individuals, the transparency, the relationship, the experience, but most importantly, what is our purpose? What is our defined purpose for business, and why are we here? You could question culture at the top, and when I talk the top, we see areas of digital culture, innovation culture. Okay, we talk about internal culture and how that affects the people by listening, empathy, understanding, learning, communicating, even how we exercise culture. I mean, culture shouldn't be reserved for a C drive. It shouldn't be on a computer. It should be a living, breathing experience. Certain writings that have actually taken place over and during the period. We've seen, certainly from chiefexecutive.net, I know for sure, interviewed some very interesting army generals on around culture and how they adopted a culture strategy before the event, the COVID pandemic event. And what was interesting with that, and the findings of that, were that they sailed through the period because they understood how and what they needed to do as a united front, and with a united vision, with a united set of objectives in executing and delivering. So very interesting. Well, there's another side to this. I mean, PwC have hired their first CPO officer. When I mean CPO officer, I mean Chief Purpose Officer. And it's very interesting to see how culture has also been embedded within that, right? Within that.
So, okay, everyone, we've come to our first poll question today. Our first poll question is this: How would the board rate its maturity as a board and as an organization on linking strategy and risk appetite? A, request management to articulate measures of risk. B, challenge management on the risks to and of strategies. Or C, request management make risk appetite a living thing? And I would note that you may need to exit out of full screen if you're not seeing the poll question. You should see the poll question on the right-hand side of your screen under the poll tab.
So let's look at the world and let's look at world events. Look, everybody has had an awful lot to deal with the geopolitical and the world effects of the 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's nothing new here. You know, if we start looking at the world event, there is nothing new. We've had events, you know, throughout decades. I mean, Isaac Newton created his best work in 1665 and 1666 in a little cottage in Lincolnshire. Maybe we wouldn't even have had gravity without him in that period, but he certainly did his best work. And as a direct result, that has to be seen as, you know, innovation, and how innovation has absolutely been accelerated in the period, but delivered amazingly great things. And we've seen the e-commerce side of that, but we've also seen the ratifications of that. I like to pick up two events which I think are really important. The Tianjin earthquake, 1976, where we had 255,000 people dead, and Spanish flu has to be, you know, probably one of the greatest pandemics that we've ever seen on the planet, which affected over 500 million people, and we had 50 million people dead. It was no big consideration there that Barack Obama, in his wisdom, decided that they needed to find the next vaccination, and they needed to find it quick because something was likely to happen. So we're not really, events around the world are nothing new. Nothing new at all. But when we start looking at what is the new era, and some of the requirements of that, strategy and planning is without a shadow of a doubt possibly one of the main priorities that boards have. And let's get this straight. Strategy is not metrics. Let's not get confused with what needs to be executed. We boards spend an awful lot of time on the strategy point, but possibly not enough. We need clear goals. We need goals that can be emphasized to defined outcomes and execution. When we start looking at some of the challenges that the board have, you know, around this, you know, we could start looking at the board pack. Board packs can have 60 pages of preparation. If you're on a publicly listed company, they can have 250 pages of detail. But there's no point if the executive board can't actually digest that information, deep dive that information, and actually have an ability to understand and challenge that data. Okay, it's that is without a shadow of doubt incredibly important. Equally, 10 years ago, cybersecurity probably wasn't really on most people's agenda. You know, is started to impact the bottom line. We started to see audit committees now transferring to having risk committees and subcommittees, cybersecurity committees, because of bottom line losses, and also looking at risk mitigation. So the heightened pressure that we've all seen, and we all work on a daily basis, nothing new, but we do need better best practices, you know, and better best practices come in many forms, you know, regulation, compliance, you know, in the financial services industry, no big surprise, you know, everyone will be, that's listening to this, will be aware of the SMCR, senior management regime, FCA changes and compliances on a regular basis. From a security point of view, you know, we're constantly being updated on the privacy issue. You know, we talk about GDPR, yes, we talk about EPR, you know, certainly in Canada and the States, and actually we talk about PECA 2, which probably has got bigger ratifications. That's the Privacy, Electronic and Communication Regulation. But objective planning both short term, medium term, and long term, have never been more important than they are today. Okay, scenario planning. We see lots of companies saying they need to reset and we need to start looking at scenario planning. But actually, the reality in scenario planning is something that should always be at a level of the C-suite or the executive board, right? So, because how can you measure risk without understanding what disaster recovery looks like, what a baseline looks like, what an optimistic view is like, and some of the companies that have actually been incredibly successful through the period have been companies that have actually understood and have knowing how to execute the scenarios that I've just described, right? And with the planning, you've got to start looking at cyber risk. We've had universities that have been hit with DDoS attacks. We've had ransomware. We've had virus. We've had breaches. TransferWise was probably a very good scenario when we start looking at data breaches. But it doesn't stop. DeanSync. All of these breaches that we start talking about, even for small businesses, it can have massive ramifications in their survival. And as soon as they don't think that it's just large corporations and large companies that suffer. It's not. It's actually companies that exist and have in any shape and form, whether small, medium, or large, within that. So I think areas of concern, I think, is going to be on and around operational risk. I think we've got more to do around conduct risk. I think risk governance is going to be a bigger concern. It's not just going to be around things like um, things like the risk register and whether that's been updated correctly. I think risk is going to be something that needs to have education on and around every level of management and employee if you're going to safeguard the future of your organization. I'm not saying that we need to be completely excessive, but the last 12 months have taught us a tremendous amount of lessons on and around the subject.
Geoff, that's great. One question I might would ask you: what type of cyber risk is the board concerned about? Is that GDPR, data breach, ransomware, Krebs? Maybe you could give some insight.
I, I think the biggest question is, number one, do we need to hire somebody onto our executive board that can actually support cybersecurity? Number one, is the play bigger than that? Is it actually technology? Okay, is it technology being at the center of what we do? How are we addressing the issues, and what are we doing from a sort of preventative and strategic point of view in order to safeguard the business? So I think, as everybody is probably aware, that the hackers are getting super smart. They're certainly a lot more skilled now at what they've been doing. And as a direct result, in the last 12 months, they've found those gaps to get through. Is the board looking at prevention strategies? Is it looking at penetration testing? So I wouldn't house ransomware into a box, although we've got plenty of examples where ransomware has been too effective to the hackers. DDoS is definitely on the rise, and certainly later in this presentation, we're going to show some statistics on the last 12 months. But I think this is a very wide subject, and my advice to anybody listening is: have you done a cyber audit on your technology stack and your product stack? If not, why not? Why is this not being executed? And if it's a case of the CTO and the CIO not actually coming to terms with who's responsible, then I think you need to start to step up to say, actually, from a board perspective and from an educational point of view internally, perhaps we need an NXD on the board that actually understands cybersecurity and understands technology. More importantly, the future of this business will depend on it.
That's great, Geoff. So thank you for that. And with that, we come into our second question, our second poll question, that is, how do high growth companies view risk management in achieving their strategic goals? A, do you feel risk management is one of the most important factors in achieving strategic goals? B, do you feel that risk management is not an important factor in achieving strategic goals? Or C, you're simply unsure?
So, as I was answering a question there with Greg, I think it's important to see there are plenty of statistics, around this particular set of statistics that I've actually sourced for this presentation is from IBM. But you know, it's so important. Employ data security governance principles. You have to. If your business wants to survive in the next decade, there are plenty of things that your business will need to focus on, but this has got to be one of them. Now, interesting enough, I was a speaker at the CIO conference, the BCS, which is the Chartered Institute for IT. Now, they did a survey with IT leaders for their 2021 report, and it showed that out of the survey there was actually only 18% that actually prioritized cybersecurity for the next 12 months, which I find astonishing, quite frankly. I prefer to look at an EY piece which was published talking around CISOs pursuing and driving a culture of security by design, which said the cyber and privacy threat is increasing and expanding. About 6 in 10 organizations, 59%, have faced a material or significant incident in the last 12 months. So with all that in mind, I would have thought that those statistics would have been more. However, what we can see is an average from all of the statistics and all of the research that is available today is that there was probably about a 40% increase in the last 12 months as a direct result of COVID-19 and the hackers taking advantage and compromising businesses as a direct result of the period, which only shows a correlation of a direct line of continual growth in cybercrime and cybersecurity. So I think, without a shadow of a doubt, these issues are worrying for boards, and they do need to be addressed. So we talk about considerations for the boards, but we talk about the risk elements, and I think in past decades, boards have basically relied on management to oversee and manage risk. And it has been known that the CEO has always been the person that's held the responsibility to shareholders and stakeholders within the business. However, the shift has been that, and it's clearly been seen that the CEOs now that are being hired need to have a technological mindset and also set of experience to be able to challenge the sort of situations that happen internally and be able to look at what preventative strategies go forward. If we looked at the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, this was a big issue around leadership at the top and the composition of the people at the top, and having these people actually with the knowledge that is required in order to address strategy for the business. I think that the persuasiveness of risk in the workings across everyday decisions means that boards must factor risk. And as I touched on earlier, we're seeing audit committees now branching out with risk governance and risk committees. And I think we need to empower the voice internally more in these subcommittees, because CEOs that do not have technological wisdom around them to make those decisions are going to be left in a very uncompromised situation, and internally the business will be compromised.
Another question for you, Geoff. With
So,
emerging trends,
sure.
should the should the company risk management structure force boards to assess past organizational exposures to risk?
Sorry, Greg, could you repeat that?
Yeah, with emerging trends, should the company risk management structure should they force boards to assess past organizational, exposures to risk?
Um, Past exposures. My belief on past exposures are you're always going to learn from past lessons learned. But I think that the speed of which of some of the attacks that we're dealing with, uh, even at geopolitical country level, business level, we are, I'm afraid to say, um, we couldn't execute a cybersecurity plan or strategy based on that alone. We must we must reach out to experts. We must have experts in the board, in the decision-making process, because those experts will craft a plan and strategy based on current trends and observations. And I think that if you just work on past lessons, I think it would be very grave. It would be a very grave situation. You need to engage others, and the bigger issue with the boards is always the education piece, because they're not all of the board totally understand sort of protocols, policies, and how these affect the business. But what they do read is the bottom line. So I think that you need constantly to refresh the experts that are leading a business through any of these situations, in my opinion, in my professional opinion.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. So risk management, oversight by the board. Um, there was a record amount of data breaches in 2020. I talked earlier about digital risk, which includes cyber risk. My professional opinion is that that is a persuasive and potentially existential conclusion. But I think that we need to understand and take account of cyber risk in real strategic decisions. I think board directors need to be appointed with governance principles. And when I talk about some of the principles, I talk about um, cybersecurity as a strategic business enabler, the drivers that impact cybersecurity, aligning cyber risk management with the business needs and not just because we need it. Ensuring organizational design supports cybersecurity. I think incorporating cybersecurity expertise into the board governance, I think, is incredibly important. And I think we need to see a bigger shift in 2021, 2022 with that taking place. But I think also, most importantly, encouraging systematic resilience and collaboration means a cyber resilient organization. So for me, these are some of the founding principles that need to be enabled, and they're not always being enabled. I've got other views on that from regulatory, but they're not. Boards need to be accountable. Now what I'm saying is accountability, not blame culture, which traditionally you see a lot within C-suite and boards, where they're looking to blame everyone else except themselves. Experts need to provide to those insights that I described. Intelligence which leads to better decisions and not minimization. Okay. We need proper response planning, and we need to have a better balance of risk. I think that's, without a shadow of a doubt. Now, this is probably one of my favorite quotes, which really speaks volumes as far as I'm concerned. James B. Comey Jr., former director of the FBI, he said, "We face cyber threats from state-sponsored hackers, hackers for hire, global cyber syndicates, and terrorists. They seek our state secrets, our trade secrets, our technology, and our ideas, things of incredible value to us all. They seek to strike our critical infrastructure and to harm our economy. Why are we not in the business world, right, listening to this? Why are we not planning and executing on preventional strategies? Why, when you have the BCS report saying only 18% of CIOs believe that cybersecurity is actually a priority for the next 12 months? I'm sorry, but this issue is going to get greater and greater and greater. The stats recently I saw, we're going to have 200 zettabytes of data. Data is going to be bigger, faster, accelerated, and so cyber crime, unless we deal with it. Okay, unless we deal with it. So some of the challenges, look, cyber risk is a complex business issue. It's one that few categories of risk that are truly systematic, affecting every aspect of our business. It's also a risk that really increases the more innovation around a company. Unfortunately, it's a risk that can never be eliminated. It's an assessment. It's something which is not going to go away anytime soon. So I think that we have to look at internally at the board at making better decisions. We need to look at the subcommittees. This needs to be put onto an agenda, but we need expertise to really identify, protect, recover, and reposit, the good things that we're trying to achieve from innovation. The culture never been a bigger subject on the board, but cybersecurity and the sort of things we talk about, and we could encapsulate that in something like business resilience, because culture on the board is incredibly important. Culture from the top down is incredibly important. Culture, living and breathing, digital culture, innovation culture, purpose-driven culture breeds trust. A lot of what we've been hearing about in the past has been lack of trust, mistrust, but regaining trust and building trust is a culture issue in itself. So on the right-hand side, you can see here the integrated culture, the framework. Innovation brings people together. Creativity brings people together. Problem solving brings people together. Face to face, energy exchange, defined outcomes. Okay, being a part of society and being able to create impact to society is incredibly important. Couple of more subjects. The last subject I've got here is the business response planning. Really, as I said earlier, the statistics prove for themselves that people were not actually geared already from a business response perspective, and that cost business. It cost business because there was lack of resiliency. Everyone was getting confused with business response planning and business continuity planning. Well, I can assure you that the employee piece and the cultural piece and the ability to step up and execute immediate change, only 20% surveyed globally and internationally had a plan in place and were executing within a very short time frame. So never has it being more important to actually execute, strategic short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning. Finally,
That's great. That's great, Geoff. Okay, we've come to our final poll question for everyone. So, are you getting the budget you need to reduce the risk to an acceptable level for your company? A, yes, I have all the money I need. B, I could use some more but can manage with my current budget. And then C, I'm drowning. No way I can reduce risk to acceptable levels with existing budget.
so with all that I've sort of shared with you in a short period, I've come to a few takeaways and a few conclusions, which I think are really important for a business not just to survive but thrive through the period. So I think it's really important to recognize that appointing a third-party cyber advisor as a non-executive of the board is actually a key milestone going forward. The CIO or a CISO as a member of the board, equally as important. They will add significant value. Establishing a cyber business response plan, having a clear plan in place to protect and, more importantly, the well-being and safety of employees, paramount. Employee cyber safety reporting and also incident and risk reporting, risk subcommittees that I talked about earlier, very important. But most importantly, board directors now need to adopt a consensus set of principles, really what I've described, because the basis of which will be an effective cyber risk governance regime. Thank you. And the final thought, I think.
Oh, go ahead, Geoff.
Okay, thank you. Final thought is, I think responding strategically to the current economic event does require a high degree of innovation and creativity. I think there needs to be an openness to challenging assumptions, that transparency that I talked before, and that openness builds trust and a willingness to look beyond the obvious. We need to start thinking about out of the box solutions in addressing these new threats and embracing new opportunities. Companies want innovation, they want to actually develop and grow, expand and grow, but we're not going to do it unless we start opening our eyes and we start deploying, risk and safety as a big part of our everyday challenge. Thank you.
That's great, Geoff. Thank you so much for that. I can see that we have many great questions that are coming in. So why don't we dive straight into our question and answer session? So let's get started with the following question.